Ever feel like history is neatly ordered? Think again. Here's a mind-blowing fact. When the last woolly mammoths were still roaming the earth on Wrangel Island, off the coast of Siberia, the Great Pyramids of Giza in Egypt already existed. That's right, the last mammoths died out around 1650 BC, but the Great Pyramid was completed way back around 2560 BC. This means there was nearly 1,000-year overlap where these magnificent creatures were still alive while ancient Egyptians were building monumental structures. It really reshapes how we see ancient history, doesn't it? Our timelines aren't always what we expect. The Pope was a woman. The legend of Pope Joan tells how in the Middle Ages, a clever woman loved learning to gain the highest education. She disguised herself as a man, traveled to Rome, and due to her brilliance, was even elected Pope. But then during a procession, her true identity was revealed by a sudden childbirth, right in the street. The legend says she was then killed to hide this shame. What an absolutely fascinating and shocking story, right? Purple, that rich, deep red, was far more than just a dye in the Roman Empire. It was a potent symbol of status, wealth, and authority, extracted from the tiny glands of sea snails. The process of making purple dye was incredibly complex and costly. This made it an ultimate luxury, reserved only for the wealthiest elite. Emperors wore purple robes as a sign of their absolute power. Senators were allowed to wear a purple stripe on their togas to denote their rank. The wearing of purple was even regulated by law and strictly limited. With the fall of Rome, purple's significance didn't vanish entirely. In the Byzantine Empire, imperial purple continued to signify divine and worldly power. Even in the Middle Ages, purple remained linked to royalty and high ecclesiastical offices before it was gradually replaced by other colors and symbols. Think wars last forever? Think again. Let's talk about the Anglo-Zanzibar War of 1896. It all started on August 27, 1896, between the United Kingdom and the Zanzibar Sultanate. The Sultan of Zanzibar died, and a new sultan, Khalid bin Barghash, took power without British approval, violating a treaty. The British weren't having it. They issued an ultimatum for him to step down. When he refused, British warships opened fire on the Sultan's palace at 9 a.m. sharp. What happened next? Pure chaos for Zanzibar. Their single-armed yacht was sunk, and the palace quickly crumbled under the bombardment. By 9:38 a.m., Zanzibar's flag was down, and the firing ceased. That's right, 38 minutes, making it officially the shortest war ever recorded. A quick, decisive conflict that ended almost before it began, showing the immense power imbalance of the time. London, 1858. A summer of superlatives, but not in a good way. The city experienced the Great Stink. Imagine all the waste, sewage, and industrial effluent from millions of people being channeled directly into the River Thames. During the extreme summer heat, the river transformed into a giant, open sewer whose stench became unbearable. The stink was so pervasive that even members of Parliament in the House of Commons hung sheets soaked in chloride over their windows. Diseases like cholera were rampant, and the catastrophic hygiene became impossible to ignore. This intolerable situation finally forced the government to act. Under the leadership of engineer Joseph Bazalgette, a revolutionary modern sewage system was built in the following years, a masterpiece of Victorian engineering. The Great Stink was, therefore, a disgusting but necessary catalyst that paradoxically saved London from itself and set the course for a cleaner, healthier future. Imagine a courtroom where the defendant is a corpse. That's exactly what happened in 897 AD during one of the most bizarre and grotesque events in papal history, the Cadaver Synod. The main character in this macabre drama was Pope Formosus, who had died months earlier. His successor, Pope Stephen VI, had a deep, venomous hatred for Formosus, for reasons still debated by historians. Perhaps it was political rivalry, or a desperate attempt to invalidate Formosus's ordinations. So, Stephen VI ordered Formosus's body to be exhumed, dressed in full papal vestments. The decaying corpse of Formosus was propped up on a throne in the Basilica of St. John Lateran in Rome. A deacon was assigned to stand next to the corpse and answer on its behalf. The charges against the deceased pope were severe: violating canon law, aspiring to the papacy illegally, and committing perjury. Stephen VI, presiding over the trial, shrieked his accusations at the silent, decaying body. Unsurprisingly, the verdict was swift. Formosus was found guilty. The gruesome punishment followed. Formosus's papal vestments were stripped off, the 3 fingers he used for blessings were cut off, and his body was dragged through the streets of Rome before being thrown into the Tiber River. This grotesque spectacle shocked even the hardened Romans and ultimately led to Stephen VI's own downfall and imprisonment. The Cadaver Synod remains a chilling testament to the dark side of medieval church politics and personal vendettas. In 1807, after signing the treaties of Tilsit, Napoleon Bonaparte was at the absolute peak of his power. To celebrate, his chief of staff, Louis Alexander Berthier, decided to throw a lavish rabbit hunt. This wasn't just any hunt. Berthier wanted to impress the emperor with an unprecedented number of rabbits. Berthier reportedly gathered thousands of rabbits from local farmers. The idea was simple: release the rabbits, and Napoleon and his entourage would have a grand time shooting them. However, when the cages were opened, something entirely unexpected happened. Instead of scattering in fear, the rabbits, perhaps mistaking Napoleon's line of distinguished gentlemen for their feeders, turned and charged, not away from the hunters, but towards them. Thousands of bunnies, an overwhelming fluffy wave, swarmed Napoleon and his party. They hopped onto his boots, clawed at his uniform, and even tried to climb his legs. The sophisticated hunt quickly descended into absolute chaos. Napoleon, despite his military genius, was utterly overwhelmed by the furry onslaught. He and his men tried to fend them off with riding crops and pistols, but it was useless. The great hunter was forced to retreat, scrambling back to his carriage in what became one of the most absurd and humiliating moments of his illustrious career. This wasn't a battle lost to cannons or cavalry, but to bunnies, a truly unique footnote in the history of one of the world's greatest conquerors. When we think of Roman emperors, we often picture grand power and traditional customs. But Emperor Nero, famous for his extravagant lifestyle and controversial rule, pushed boundaries in ways that shocked even his contemporaries. While Nero was married multiple times to women, including Empress Octavia and Poppaea Sabina, there's a particularly striking detail about his personal life that stands out. Around 67 AD, he took his unconventional behavior to an extraordinary level. Nero publicly married 2 men in separate ceremonies, both of whom were eunuchs. First was a freedman named Pythagoras, whom he married with all the solemnities of a traditional Roman wedding, including a dowry, a bridal veil, and a marriage bed. Nero himself reportedly took on the role of the bride in this ceremony. Later, after Poppaea Sabina's death, Nero married another young man named Sporus, who bore a striking resemblance to his deceased wife. Nero even had Sporus castrated and dressed him in female attire, calling him Sabina. These acts were deeply scandalous, even for the famously liberal Roman elite. They weren't just about personal preference. They were seen as a deliberate defiance of Roman social norms and a challenge to traditional Roman masculinity and imperial dignity. Nero's marriages to men stand as a powerful, albeit controversial, testament to his desire to defy conventions and solidify his image as a ruler unbound by societal expectations. Imagine a blast so powerful it flattened an entire city and caused a tsunami, all before the atomic age. That's the story of the Halifax explosion in Nova Scotia, Canada, on December 6, 1917. During World War I, Halifax was a crucial port for sending supplies to Europe. On that fateful morning, 2 ships collided in the narrow harbor, the Norwegian vessel SSMO and the French cargo ship Mont Blanc, which was dangerously packed with nearly 3,000 tons of highly explosive materials, TNT, picric acid, and benzene, all destined for the war effort in France. The collision itself wasn't immediately catastrophic, but a fire broke out on the Mont Blanc, and for about 20 agonizing minutes, it drifted, burning intensely, while onlookers gathered to watch the spectacle. They had no idea of the unimaginable power contained within its hull. At approximately 9:04 a.m., the Mont Blanc detonated in a colossal explosion. It was the largest man-made explosion before the development of nuclear weapons. The blast created a shockwave that flattened nearly 2.5 square kilometers of Halifax, instantly killing thousands. A massive tsunami followed, caused by the displacement of water, sweeping away buildings and ships. In total, over 1,900 people died, 9,000 were injured, and tens of thousands were left homeless. The force of the explosion was so immense that a piece of the ship's anchor, weighing over half a ton, was found miles away. The Halifax explosion stands as a stark and tragic reminder of the devastating power of explosives and the fragility of human life, long before the world knew the true terror of atomic bombs. New York City in the early 1700s wasn't just a bustling port. It was a place where slavery was deeply entrenched. By 1712, about 1 in 5 residents was enslaved, primarily of African descent. Conditions were brutal, and the desire for freedom simmered beneath the surface. On the night of April 6, 1712, that simmering discontent boiled over. Around 23 enslaved Africans, armed with guns, axes, and knives, set fire to an outbuilding on Maiden Lane. As white colonists rushed to put out the blaze, the rebels ambushed them, killing 9 and injuring more. The city quickly descended into panic. The governor called out the militia, and a massive manhunt began. The rebels fled north, hoping to escape into the woods, but they were relentlessly pursued. Within days, most of the participants were captured. The retribution was swift and incredibly harsh. Of the enslaved people involved, 21 were executed. Some were hanged, 1 was burned alive, and another was broken on the wheel. A brutal public display meant to terrify the enslaved population and deter future rebellions. This uprising, though ultimately suppressed, had a profound impact. It exposed the deep-seated fear of rebellion among slaveholders and led to even stricter, more oppressive slave codes in New York. While a tragic chapter, it stands as a powerful testament to the desperate struggle for freedom in colonial America. Imagine being stranded, far from home, with angry, hungry people threatening you. That's exactly where Christopher Columbus found himself in 1504, during his 4th voyage. His ships were shipwrecked on the island of Jamaica, and his crew was growing restless and rebellious. The indigenous Arawak people of Jamaica, initially hospitable, were becoming fed up with providing food for Columbus and his hungry men. They started refusing supplies, leading to a desperate situation for the marooned Europeans. Columbus, a keen navigator with access to astronomical tables, had an idea. He knew a total lunar eclipse was coming on February 29, 1504. He called the Arawak chiefs together and, with a grave expression, warned them that his god was angry at their refusal to provide food. As a sign of this divine displeasure, he declared that the moon would turn red and disappear that very night. The Arawak chiefs scoffed at first, but as the evening progressed and the moon began to dim and then turn a ghostly red, panic set in. They watched in terror as the moon seemingly vanished from the sky, just as Columbus had predicted. Terrified, the chiefs pleaded with Columbus to intercede with his god. He, of course, agreed to do so, pretending to pray intensely as the eclipse reached its peak. Only when the moon began to reappear, signaling the end of the eclipse, did he tell them his god had relented, on the condition they resume providing food. The trick worked perfectly. From that day on, the Arawak people continued to supply Columbus and his men until their rescue, proving that sometimes knowledge of the heavens can be more powerful than any weapon. In the tumultuous world of Tudor England, power struggles were deadly, and few stories are as tragic as that of Lady Jane Grey. Her reign as queen lasted a mere 9 days. It all began in 1553, with the death of the young Protestant king, Edward VI. Edward, fearing the Catholic restoration under his half-sister Mary, desperately wanted to keep England Protestant. Influenced by his chief minister, the Duke of Northumberland, he named his cousin, the highly educated and devoutly Protestant Lady Jane Grey, as his successor, skipping over both Mary and Elizabeth. Jane, a shy and scholarly young woman, initially resisted the crown, reportedly fainting when told she was queen. She knew the immense danger, but she was eventually persuaded, proclaimed queen on July 10, 1553. However, public sentiment quickly swung in favor of Mary Tudor, Edward's elder half-sister, who had a stronger claim to the throne by birthright. Mary rallied support, and nobles and commoners alike flocked to her banner. Within days, Northumberland's support collapsed, and Mary marched triumphantly into London. On July 19, 1553, just 9 days after her proclamation, Lady Jane Grey was deposed. Initially imprisoned, Jane became a dangerous symbol for Protestant rebels. Fearing further uprisings, Queen Mary I eventually ordered her execution. On February 12, 1554, at just 16 years old, Lady Jane Grey walked to the scaffold at the Tower of London, a pawn in a brutal game of thrones, her brief reign a stark reminder of the ruthless nature of Tudor politics.